Former Conservative cabinet minister Chuck Strahl is under fire from an environmental group for lobbying Enbridge in BC. That's the company behind the Northern Gateway Pipeline. Chuck Strahl serves as Canada's top spy watchdog. Stephen Harper appointed him as the chair of SIRC. That's the Security Intelligence Review Committee back in June of 2012, the year after Mr. Strahl left federal politics. Well, now questions are being raised about this entire process. Is Mr. Strahl in a conflict of interest for lobbying on behalf of Enbridge for the contentious Northern Gateway Pipeline project? Now, we should point out, Chuck Strahl has not broken any rules, but should a federal appointee to a critical committee be allowed to lobby a provincial government? Joining me now from Toronto, Craig Scott, the NDP's critic for Democratic and Parliamentary Reform. Good to see you, and Happy New Year. You too, in Regina, the Liberal Deputy Leader, Ralph Goodale. Good to see you. And Happy New Year to Mr. Goodale. We did ask a Conservative representative. As I said, none was made available. Let me start with you, Mr. Scott. Is Chuck Strahl, in your view, in a conflict of interest, even though he is not lobbying the federal government, which he's prohibited from doing under the Conflict of Interest Act?
I think from a combination of a moral and common sense perspective, yes, he is. I don't think we have to look at whether the acts, the Lobbying Act or the Conflict of Interest Act have been violated at this stage. The average Canadian is going to look at this, and to use a technical term, they're going to say this stinks. Especially when you're lobbying for a project that doesn't know any jurisdictional boundaries. If Enbridge is going to be talking to the BC government, they're going to be asking things like, can you guys get on board and support the federal cabinet for a decision to allow the Northern Gateway to go ahead? So it's an end run around the fact that he couldn't be lobbying the cabinet directly. But
I guess my question, you say it stinks. I mean, the rules are the rules. Mr. Strahl is following the rules. If he is, he's a private citizen now. He runs a consulting firm.
He's a government and council appointment.
Okay, but if he's following the rules, is the problem with the rules, or is the problem, in your view, with Mr. Strahl? Why can't he follow the rules?
It's with both. Because one thing, we can't get into this trap of thinking that the moment you nip between the technical provisions of rules, you're suddenly all morally fine. I mean, the fact is you have to make judgment calls about what makes sense on an ethical, moral plane. And the fact is, this guy is he's not a private citizen in any normal sense. He is the chair of the oversight body for the leading security agency in Canada. And that's a governor and council appointment. It's one of the most important appointments the government makes, and it's tied into an organization, Enbridge, that has relationships with CSIS. We found that out in the past year. And so it really, really, at any kind of a moral level, is a problem of conflict of interest. Whether this is a technical violation, I really don't care.
Okay, so that's your view. What about you, Mr. Goodale? What's your view? Is Chuck Strahl, if he says, I'm not lobbying on a federal level, I'm following the conflict of interest rules, I haven't broken a rule, I'm lobbying on a provincial level, what's the problem?
Well, it does appear that he would be trying to do through the back door what he would be prohibited from doing through the front door. Obviously, the rules would say he could not lobby federally, but he is lobbying provincially. And it's on the same project, dealing with many of the same players, at least on one side of the equation. So I think it does put him in a very awkward position. And it calls into question the judgment that's been made here. And surely, in the federal official that is charged with the responsibility of supervising the spy agency, being the oversight for the spy agency, one quality, one characteristic you look for is good judgment. And I think Mr. Strahl has put himself here in a very difficult position, a federal official lobbying a provincial government on a federal project where the cabinet says they haven't made a decision yet. That would seem to be a very awkward and quite frankly, unseemly situation. So calling on the judgment issue here with respect to SIRC, remember, SIRC's reputation is in a bit of a mess lately because of the Arthur Porter situation. Mr. Harper's last appointment to this job of supervising the spy agency, he's in jail in Panama. So surely the new chairman of SIRC, Mr. Strahl, should be very sensitive to any untoward implications that arise here in relation to his job as the supervisor of Canada's spies.
Right. So I should just tell people here, Chuck Strahl, former minister, is designated as a public office holder under the Federal Lobbying Act. He is prohibited from lobbying the federal government for a 5-year period post-employment, and he's required to declare his prior status as an MP in the lobbying registry. Now, he's now registered as a lobbyist provincially, Mr. Scott. What do you think has to happen then? Do you think he has to leave as the head of SIRC or stop lobbying? What do you think? What actions do you think he needs to take?
Evan, a quick correction there. It is true that he's prohibited from lobbying in his capacity as a former minister. At the same time, the real issue here, and that's federally, the real issue here is that as the chair of SIRC, he should not be engaging in this lobbying. So it actually really doesn't have much to do at all with his former status as a cabinet minister.
Well, let me just push back there.
No, I know what you said.
Because his position is considered a part-time appointment, some have argued that he's clear of the restrictions in the Conflict of Interest Act.
And you're not following what I've said. I've said exactly that's. But the issue is the fact that whether or not he's in technical violation of the Act, with respect to being the chair, part-time chair of SIRC, morally, he should not be doing this. So let's not confuse it with the technical violation issue around being a former minister.
So what should happen?
And so what should happen is that at minimum, somebody who, frankly, a lot of people respect, and I'm absolutely surprised that Chuck Strahl would make this judgment call. He has to immediately, at minimum, say, that's it. I understand I made a mistake. Recuse himself from any further involvement with Enbridge, sever ties, and no longer engage in any lobbying at all. That's completely inappropriate for this particular governor and council appointment.
Mr. Goodale, what's your take? What should happen now? Well, clearly, this is one of the most sensitive appointments that the government makes. A distinguished Canadian to provide the oversight of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. The person in that role has to be absolutely above reproach. It's a case where it's not only important for justice to be done, but for justice to be manifestly seen to be done. Because it has to pass every test, including the common sense smell test. And there's a potential conflict here with Mr. Strahl supervising the spy agency that obviously has some role in relation to this particular pipeline project. That would seem to be untoward. And again, a federal official lobbying a provincial government on a federal project that the cabinet says it hasn't approved yet. All right. Well, that's just an untenable situation, and I think a person of good judgment, and I hope Mr. Strahl is that, would recognize this predicament is out of hand and withdraw from one role or the other. Either he's a lobbyist or he's the spy watchdog. I don't think he can be both.
Let me just read something to our viewers. In June of 2012, in the National Post newspaper, there was a profile of Chuck Strahl after he was named the head of SIRC, the Security Intelligence Review Committee. And he said, quote, he'll continue to build his consultancy, he's a consultant, help companies create and execute business strategies, but he, quote, won't lobby governments. He says he never has. In the event of a potential problem, he says he'll call up the Canada's Ethics Commission or consult with her. I even called her when this appointment first came up. So that's an interesting coda there. We tried to reach Mr. Strahl today. We could not get him on the program. We'll continue to try. And again, we did ask the Conservatives to put up a commentator, an MP, to talk about this. None were made available. Craig Scott, Ralph Goodale, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan.